Welcome. Today we're exploring the sources on a figure who truly reshaped our relationship with the planet. We're talking about Jacques-Yves Cousteau. Born in 1910 in France, he was, of course, the man in the red hat who fundamentally changed how we see, explore, and ultimately protect the sea.
That's right. And when you really get into the source material, what you see is a life that was defined by, well, relentless innovation and also a complete transformation of purpose.
A transformation, that's a good word for it.
It really is. We're going to trace his whole evolution. He starts out as a promising naval pilot, but his career is cut short. And that pushes him to become this global innovator and then finally one of the world's most visible and compelling environmental advocates.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to pull out the most crucial points regarding his pioneering inventions, especially the Aqua-Lung, of course.
Yeah.
We'll also cover his massive media empire, his really significant advocacy work, and the lasting influence he continues to have on ocean conservation. And we're sticking solely to the material we've gathered to give you the full and sometimes complex picture of the man who really invited the world beneath the waves.
To really get a handle on Cousteau's trajectory, you have to start with the irony of his early years. His life was seemingly set on a very conventional path.
Right. He wasn't born a marine biologist or an explorer.
Not at all. He was a serious military student. He did his preparatory studies at the Collège Stanislas in Paris, which is, a very rigorous academic environment. And by 1930, he's a graduate of the École Navale as a gunnery officer.
His career path is pointing straight towards a very traditional, very successful naval career.
Exactly. But then the sources describe this pivotal moment, a really severe automobile accident.
And this wasn't just a minor crash.
No, not at all. It was serious enough to break both of his arms multiple times. It was a career-altering injury. It completely ruled him out of his planned path in naval aviation.
For most people, that would just be the end of it, the end of their ambitions.
You'd think so. But for Cousteau, it acted as a catalyst. It forced him to seek recovery and exercise in the water, which drove him directly toward this passion he already had for the ocean.
And that pivot wasn't immediate, right? It was a gradual thing.
Very gradual. It was incremental. Once he was serving on a cruiser in Toulon, he started his initial underwater experiments. And this is where he connects with some really key early collaborators.
Like Philippe Tellier.
Precisely. In 1936, his friend and fellow officer Philippe Tellier lends him some Fernez underwater goggles. Now, you have to understand, these weren't modern masks.
No, they were pretty rudimentary.
Very. They were predecessors, just allowing for clear vision underwater. But for Cousteau, that simple tool was an awakening. It gave him his first truly clear, unobstructed view of that world beneath the surface. It just transformed the hazy blue into a world that was ready to be explored.
It's amazing how those tiny technological steps, from a simple goggle to a regulator, just completely reshaped history.
It is.
But before we get to the war years and all that intense innovation, we should probably situate his early naval service. The sources mention he was involved with the French Navy's intelligence service.
Yes, the information service. He was on missions that gave him a pretty unique global perspective for the time.
His assignments were all over the place, geographically.
They were. He was in Shanghai and Japan between 1935 and 1938, and then later in the USSR in 1939. And this military background, this experience in intelligence, it's really crucial context for the kind of ingenuity he would show during the war.
Right. So the early 1940s, the Second World War, the sources really stress how crucial this period was for the history of autonomous diving.
It was. Largely out of necessity and resource constraints. After the 1940 armistice, Cousteau and his wife Simone, they found refuge in Megève. And it was there, during a really dark period for France, that he befriended the Écart family.
And that connection became the engine for his first media successes.
It did. Marcel Ishak was a renowned filmmaker, but he specialized in high mountains.
That's such a fascinating pairing. The mountain filmmaker and the ocean explorer.
But what's beautiful about it is their shared ambition. They both wanted to reveal these environments that were totally inaccessible to the public. Ishak was tackling the vertical high-altitude world, and Cousteau was focused on the deep, horizontal ocean floor. They just leveraged each other's expertise.
And their synergy led to actual films, even in the middle of the war.
It did, and very quickly. In 1942, they produced the first French underwater film, Par 18 mètres de fond.
Which means 18 meters deep.
Right. And what's so critical to understand here is the technological hurdle. This was done without any breathing apparatus.
Just breath-holding, free diving.
Exactly, relying solely on freediving in the Ambias Islands. They used a specially constructed depth pressure-proof camera case that was developed by an engineer named Leon Vesch. It showed the world that the ocean could be documented, but it also immediately highlighted the severe limitations of human physiology.
A limitation that was overcome almost immediately. Their very next project, Épave or Shipwrecks, in 1943, that's the moment that really shifts history.
It is, because this is where the Aqua-Lung prototypes first saw action. It takes the story from, we can look underwater to we can stay underwater.
So this brings us to the invention that defines his legacy.
It really does. And it's important to clarify, Cousteau wasn't inventing the idea of self-contained breathing from scratch. He himself had used the 1926 Le Prieur apparatus.
But that had major problems.
Huge problems. The issue with Le Prieur's design was that it was a constant flow system. Air just flowed continuously, whether the diver was inhaling or not.
So it was just constantly leaking air then?
Pretty much. The air was forced out under pressure from a tank, often regulated by just a manual valve. This meant a massive amount of waste and, consequently, very short dives, maybe a few minutes.
So it was more of a novelty than a practical tool.
Exactly. It limited activity to essentially a recreational novelty. The monumental turning point came through a collaboration during the occupation. Cousteau sought out Émile Gagnon,
An engineer at Air Liquide.
right, who specialized in industrial gas regulation. Gagnon had, back in 1942, invented a demand regulator, which was originally designed to improve the efficiency of automotive gas generators because of wartime fuel rationing.
The genius was in the application.
Pure genius. By integrating Gagnon's demand regulator, which, crucially, only releases gas when the pressure differential indicates the diver has inhaled into the self-contained apparatus, they effectively co-invented the first successful open-circuit HCDA device.
SKVA, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus.
And the French version was trademarked as the Aqua-Lung. Prototypes were being manufactured by Air Liquide starting in 1943. This solved the duration problem, and it revolutionized underwater exploration, work, and military capabilities just instantly.
And all this innovation was happening alongside his very complex wartime service. He was still an active naval officer.
He was, and the sources commend him for it. He organized and assembled a commando operation specifically to target Italian espionage services operating in France. He received several military decorations for these daring deeds. It really emphasizes his loyalty to the French forces resisting occupation.
It's such a dark and complex period of history, and the sources don't shy away from the contrast with his own family situation.
No, they don't. His brother, Pierre-Antoine Cousteau, was a very visible figure in the collaborationist movement. The sources describe him as a pen anti-Semite who edited an extremely right-wing newspaper called Je suis partout.
That's a staggering familial contrast. One brother is a commando for the resistance, the other is supporting the collaborationist regime.
And Pierre-Antoine faced serious consequences after the liberation. He received a death sentence in 1946. It was later commuted to a life sentence, and he was released in 1954.
And the sources make it clear that Jacques-Yves maintained a necessary distance from his brother's politics during that whole period.
He did. And after the war, Cousteau's military connections proved absolutely essential. Admiral Lemonnier, who recognized the potential of the Aqua-Lung, supported him and Telliers in setting up the GRS, the Underwater Research Group of the French Navy, in Toulon.
Which laid the groundwork for everything that came next.
It did. This institutional foundation provided the government funding, the logistical support, and the manpower for his next era of global exploration.
So with the Aqua-Lung perfected and this institutional support from the GRS, Cousteau and his team they immediately start pushing the boundaries of what was possible underwater.
They do. The late 1940s were all about these highly practical but very dangerous naval missions.
Things like mine clearance.
Yes, essential mine clearance, general exploration of the French coastline, and critically physiological tests to understand the real limits of diving at depth. Things like nitrogen narcosis.
His 1948 Mediterranean campaign on the sloop Elie Monnier, that was particularly important for setting precedents, wasn't it?
It was. And it was aboard the Elie Monnier that they achieved a historical first.
The first underwater archaeology operation using autonomous diving.
Exactly. They explored the famous Roman wreck of Mahdia in Tunisia. The ability to stay underwater for extended periods, to maneuver freely, it just paved the way for a whole new scientific field. Before this, deep excavation required this cumbersome, heavy, surface-fed apparatus. This team changed the game.
But as you said, this era was fraught with risks. The innovation was outpacing the physiological knowledge.
It was, and the sources document a profound tragedy that serves as a grim marker of those experimental years. In 1947, near Toulon, Chief Petty Officer Maurice Fargues became the first diver known to die while using an Aqua-Lung.
And we really have to pause to reflect on that. Fargues was part of the GRS team. He was attempting a new deepwater record, pushing to 120 meters.
At that depth, the risks of oxygen toxicity and more likely severe nitrogen narcosis, they were just immense and not fully understood.
We must extend our deepest and most sincere sympathy to the family of Maurice Fargues. We honor his sacrifice, which ultimately contributed to the safety protocols that would later define diving. It's a very somber reminder that these early explorations were truly voyages into the unknown. They demanded a high price.
That sacrifice really underscores the commitment of these men. But the drive to explore, it just continued. Cousteau realized that to achieve the scale he envisioned, he needed his own vessel, one not reliant on naval resources.
Which brings us to the iconic ship known all over the world,
The Calypso.
In 1950, Cousteau founded the French Oceanographic Campaigns, the FOC, which allowed him to act independently, and through that organization, he secured the lease for a former Royal Navy minesweeper that had been converted into a ferry.
And he got it from the Anglo-Irish millionaire and politician Thomas Lowell Guinness.
The lease itself is just legendary.
It is. Guinness provided the vessel to Cousteau for a symbolic £1 a year. He essentially donated it to science and exploration.
And Cousteau immediately refitted it, turned it into his principal mobile laboratory for research and filming. The Calypso really became the physical manifestation of his life's work for the next 4 decades.
And it was aboard vessels like the Calypso and the earlier Monnier that Cousteau began making these profound scientific observations. The source material highlights one in particular, a really insightful observation he detailed in his first major book, The Silent World.
This is the one about porpoises.
Yes, and it's fascinating because it shows his acute observational skills long before the underlying science was confirmed. He correctly surmised the existence of echolocation.
He just figured out that complex biological mechanism by watching a slight course deviation. What did people even think about porpoises at that time? They weren't widely understood as natural sonar experts, were they?
Absolutely not. I mean, humans were developing and using sonar technology, but the idea that small cetaceans had a sophisticated biological equivalent was still just an emerging idea. Cousteau's observation was simple but profound.
What did he see?
He was watching a group of porpoises following his research vessel near the Straits of Gibraltar. When his ship, the Monnier, changed course slightly off the optimal deepest path of the channel, the porpoises followed for a few minutes. But then they quickly and definitively diverged. They headed back toward the central, optimal course, completely ignoring the ship's slightly wrong path.
So his conclusion was this powerful piece of predictive science.
It was. He realized that the cetaceans had a way to perceive and navigate the optimal route beneath the water, independent of their eyes or the surface conditions. He concluded they possessed something like sonar. It's just a hallmark of his exploratory mind.
While his scientific mind was sharp, his real revolutionary genius was in his ability to communicate his discoveries, turning exploration from this niche pursuit into a global entertainment format.
That's the key. And the first huge step in that media domination was the 1956 documentary The Silent World,
which he co-directed with the great French filmmaker Louis Malle. Its success was just monumental. It was one of the first major films to use color underwater cinematography.
Right. Before this, the ocean depths, if you saw them at all, were usually murky and indistinct. Cousteau brought vibrant life and color to The Silent World.
And the reaction was immediate.
Overwhelming. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It remained the only documentary to ever win that award until 2004. And it also won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1957. That dual success just catapulted him from being a naval researcher to a legitimate, globally recognized media personality.
And this domination only sped up with television. The sources detail how he proactively engaged with American TV companies, ABC, Metro Media, NBC.
Which resulted in the massively successful series, The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. It became a cultural phenomenon. It ran for 10 years, from 1966 to 1976. For a whole generation, he was the face of the sea.
And the sources highlight the really sophisticated strategy behind his public persona, the commander in the red bonnet.
It was powerful, deliberate branding. That look was inherited from standard French naval diving dress, which was red or orange for visibility, but He made it his own. It gave the films this distinct, recognizable, and deeply personalized adventure style.
Right. You weren't just watching scientists at work.
No, you were watching the commander leading an intimate expedition. It turned scientific exploration into a distinctive adventure brand, instantly recognized worldwide.
And that success led to a second series, The Cousteau Odyssey, which ran on public television from 77 to 82. His total output is just immense, over 120 television documentaries.
Cousteau understood that just visiting the ocean floor wasn't enough. True understanding, especially for long-term work, meant humans had to establish a sustained presence there.
And this drive to understand how humans could live and work in the deep led to his most audacious technological projects, the underwater habitats.
Yes, the Conshelf projects, short for Continental Shelf Stations, also known as Precontinent, the first, the second, the three, they ran in quick succession from 1962 to 1965, and they just captured the public imagination.
They proved that underwater living wasn't just science fiction.
The objective was profound: to establish genuine underwater villages. They were essentially saturation diving experiments aimed at increasing the depth and duration at which people could continuously live and work under the sea.
To understand why that was necessary, we have to talk about the physics of diving, about decompression sickness.
Exactly. When you breathe compressed air, inert gases like nitrogen dissolve into your body tissues. The deeper you go, the faster they dissolve. If you ascend too quickly, those gases form bubbles, that's the bends, and it can be fatal.
And saturation diving was the solution?
It was. The concept is that once your body tissues have absorbed the maximum amount of inert gas for a specific depth, once you're saturated, you can stay at that depth indefinitely without increasing the risk. You only need to do one single long decompression when you finally come back up. It drastically increases your effective working time.
The Conshelf projects proved this concept step by step. Conshelf I, in 62, had 2 men spend a week at 10 meters.
Right. And then Conshelf II in 1963 was much more complex. It was in the Red Sea. 5 men lived in a larger star-shaped house at 11 meters for a whole month, while 2 others, the aquanauts, lived even deeper in a secondary habitat at 25 meters.
And the peak was Conshelf III.
In 1965, off the French Riviera, a team of 6 divers spent 22 days sealed in a spherical habitat at a staggering depth of 100 meters. They were breathing a sophisticated mix of helium and oxygen to mitigate the narcotic effects of nitrogen. It was a massive undertaking.
Beyond fixed habitats, he also needed mobile access to the deeper seafloor. This led to the creation of the SP-350 Denise, the diving saucer.
The Denise was invented in 1959 with engineer Jean Mollard. It wasn't designed for extreme depth, but it was revolutionary for maneuverability and observation. It was designed, like the name says, for exploring the topography of the ocean floor.
And the saucer shape was for hydrodynamics.
And visibility allowed it to hover, maneuver easily in tight spaces close to the seabed, and you carry these large, clear observation ports for the 2-person crew. It was effectively a mobile underwater camera platform.
And the testing was successful.
Very. The initial model could safely reach 350 meters, far beyond the capability of the Aqua-Lung at the time. They later did another experiment in 1965 with 2 vehicles, and they reached 500 meters. The Denise was crucial for enabling close-up, continuous observation of the seabed.
And at the same time as all these tech projects, he's also working to establish structure and influence within the global marine community.
He knew that for diving to thrive, it needed standardized institutions. One of the most significant was the Confédération Mondiale des Activités Aquatiques, or CMAS. He was a founding member and its inaugural president for 14 years, from 1959 to 1973.
CMAS standardized diving training, safety protocols. It transformed diving from a specialized pursuit into a globally accessible activity.
He also took on a very visible institutional role in Monaco. He was elected director of the Oceanographic Museum of Monaco in 1957. That gave him a prestigious permanent base of operations, and it was independent of the French Navy, which enhanced his autonomy.
And his stature just grew internationally. The sources highlight his admission to the United States National Academy of Sciences,
which was a clear recognition of his scientific and technological contributions on a global stage. He successfully moved from being a French naval officer to being an internationally recognized visionary.
As his fame and influence grew, he made a conscious transition. He moved from being an explorer and inventor to becoming one of the world's most recognized environmental activists.
He absolutely leveraged his celebrity status for political ends. And the sources detail a crucial early success in 1960 that really solidified that reputation: the campaign against radioactive dumping in the Mediterranean.
This wasn't just a protest, it was a high-stakes scientific and political battle.
It was. The French Commissariat of the Énergie Atomique, the CEA, had a plan to dispose of large quantities of radioactive waste into the deep sea between Nice and Corsica. Their argument was that there was little water circulation at the dump site, so the waste would stay put.
But Cousteau and his scientific allies immediately challenged that.
They did. He was joined by several prominent French oceanographers. They publicly repudiated the CEA's argument, saying it was scientifically unsound. They argued that deep currents could disperse the waste across the entire Mediterranean basin.
And Cousteau was masterful in using his media platform.
Incredibly effective. He organized a publicity campaign that gained massive popular support in less than 2 weeks, and it culminated in this dramatic physical act of defiance.
The moment where women and children sat on the railway tracks?
Exactly. To stop the train carrying the radioactive waste. The public pressure, the scientific counter-argument, the physical blockage. It was too much for the government.
Yeah.
The CEA chief was forced to postpone the dump, and the waste was sent back. It showed Cousteau's media power translated into real political victories.
That initial success was formalized years later with the establishment of the Cousteau Society for the Protection of Ocean Life in 1973.
Which he co-founded with his 2 sons, Jean-Michel and Philippe, and Frederick Hyman. It was designed to channel that global recognition into sustained, organized conservation.
However, the sources also require us to discuss a highly controversial aspect of his environmental views, specifically on population.
He was deeply concerned about human impact on the environment, and this led him to take a very severe stance on global population control.
And we have to impartially relay the content from a November 1991 interview with the UNESCO Courier. In that discussion, he clearly stated his support for human population control and decrease.
Right. And the sources widely quote him stating that world population must be stabilized, and he made an estimation that to do that, we must eliminate 350,000 people today. It's an estimate that, taken literally, is profoundly shocking.
It is, but it's important to include the context that the sources provide, the very next sentence he uttered.
Which was, this is so horrible to contemplate that we shouldn't even say it. But the general situation in which we are involved is lamentable.
The sources present his stance not as a policy prescription, but as the lament of an environmentalist who is deeply worried about planetary limits. We convey this view impartially, without endorsement, just to illustrate the complexity of his late-career environmental philosophy.
And while his life was defined by the glamour of exploration, the reality of high-risk frontier work meant that tragedy was an unwelcome visitor.
Yes, something the sources show deeply affected him and his family. The first serious loss on the Calypso crew was in December 1972, while they were filming in Antarctica.
Michel Laval, the Calypso's second-in-command, was tragically struck and killed by a helicopter rotor during a transfer operation.
It's a moment that just brings the constant danger of these expeditions into sharp focus.
It does. We extend our deep sympathy to Michel Laval's family and everyone involved in that terrible accident.
And a much greater personal tragedy followed 7 years later, in 1979. His second son, Philippe Cousteau, died when his PBY Catalina flying boat crashed in the Tagus River near Lisbon.
And the sources emphasize that Philippe was more than just his son. He was widely seen as Cousteau's preferred and designated successor. He'd co-produced all his father's films since 1969.
That's just devastating. Not just losing a son, but the future of his entire life's work.
Exactly. The sources say he was deeply affected, which feels like a profound understatement. It's impossible to study his later life without understanding the depth of that emotional scar.
And this tragedy had immediate consequences for the organization.
It did. After Philippe's death, Cousteau called upon his eldest son, Jean-Michel, who was an architect, to join the Cousteau organization. That partnership, which was born out of necessity and grief, lasted for 14 years.
The final 2 decades of Cousteau's life were really characterized by this enormous international recognition, continued influence, and also the inevitable friction that comes with managing a global legacy.
Absolutely. Despite the personal challenges, the global acknowledgement of his contributions only grew. He received major honors, like the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1985 from President Ronald Reagan.
And in France, his cultural status was solidified in 1988 when he was admitted to the prestigious Académie Française.
It signaled his transition from being just an explorer to being a foundational figure in French cultural and intellectual history.
His influence moved into the highest global political arenas. After the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, he became a regular consultant for the UN and the World Bank.
But the sources also document the increasingly strained family relations, particularly with his oldest son, Jean-Michel.
The conflict really centered on the definition of the Cousteau name.
It did, and it culminated in a public legal battle in 1995. Cousteau sought an injunction to prevent Jean-Michel from using the Cousteau name for his for-profit Cousteau Fiji Islands resort.
Cousteau felt it diluted and confused the charitable mission he had spent decades building.
And the court sided with Jacques. It issued an order against Jean-Michel, legally establishing that he could not confuse his for-profit business with his father's nonprofit endeavors. It was a clear attempt by the elder Cousteau to protect the integrity of his legacy.
And finally, we have to talk about the unfortunate fate of the Calypso. On January 11th, 1996, it was rammed and sunk by a barge in the port of Singapore.
Just a devastating end for such an iconic vessel. It was refloated and towed back to France. And the sources confirm that the Cousteau Society is planning to convert the Calypso into a permanent museum, preserving the physical shell of the ship as a testament to his exploratory years.
Jacques Cousteau died of a heart attack in Paris on June 25, 1997. He was 87, and he left behind a body of work that is just staggering in its scope.
It really is. The sources note his vast output. More than 120 television documentaries, over 50 books, works like The Silent World and The Shark, Splendid Savage of the Sea, and the Cousteau Society, which still has 300,000 members.
Interestingly, he often described himself modestly, not as a conservationist or a celebrity, but as an oceanographic technician.
But his lasting genius wasn't just the Aqua-Lung, it was his pioneering method of communication, which the sources call divulgationism.
That's a concept that really needs defining. It's the key to his cultural impact.
It was essentially a simple, accessible way of sharing complex scientific concepts, translating them into compelling public narratives. Before Cousteau, science communication was often dry and academic. He changed that by injecting personal narrative, dramatic pacing, and, of course, the branding of the commander in the red bonnet.
Exactly. The personalized adventure style, the color cinematography, the intimate voiceover. These weren't just stylistic choices. They were the mechanism of simplification. Divulgationism made the underwater world relatable and transformed dense science into a compelling adventure.
We also have to impartially address a highly controversial aspect of his environmental record, linked to his time in Monaco. The sources clearly identify the Monaco Oceanographic Museum, and potentially Cousteau himself, as being responsible for introducing the invasive killer algae, Colurpetaxifolia, into the Mediterranean.
It highlights the complex, sometimes unintended consequences of even well-intentioned scientific work. That algae has had a significantly negative, lasting effect on the native Mediterranean ecosystem.
It's a pertinent example that even when aiming for scientific advancement, environmental mistakes can be made.
But the work continues today. The Cousteau Society is now led by his second wife, Francine Triplett, and his grandson, Fabien Cousteau, is constructing a new underwater research habitat called Proteus, planned for 2025. It directly echoes his grandfather's Conshelf projects.
And his influence just permeates culture. The sources note many tributes, from the John Denver song Calypso to the character Steve Zissou in Wes Anderson's film The Life Aquatic.
Cousteau's entire life seems to illustrate his own philosophy, captured in his quote, "The sea, the great unifier, is man's only hope. We are all in the same boat."
His legacy is that incredible integration of three fields: groundbreaking innovation, compelling global media, and ultimately driving the creation of a global environmental consciousness just by showing people the majesty and fragility of what they stood to lose.
That successful integration of invention and activism really raises a final thought for you to consider.
It does.
Given Cousteau's ability to take the obscure science of the 1950s and turn it into a global cause, what critical knowledge or discovery resides in relative obscurity today? Maybe related to deep-sea mining or microplastics or microbial life.
What's the next story?
Right. What's the next environment-changing story that's just waiting for its red-hatted commander to bring it to the world?
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the fascinating source material surrounding Jacques Cousteau.
Thanks for listening.